It's my pleasure to be here to introduce our last panel of the day, whose title is Towards an Equitable and Just Gender Relationship. And the way I see this panel is helping us to bridge the gap between theory of this wonderful vision of this egalitarian perspective about women in Islam and the practice where that is not the reality for millions of Muslim women living around the world, where illiteracy and poverty is imposed on them because they are female, which is in direct contradiction to Islam. So before we go on to our speakers, I just thought I would try to set the stage a little bit with what I think is important in terms of context. And we're starting to now get into a little bit more depth as far as Islamic law and jurisprudence is concerned, because a lot of issues that women face are related to laws that have been developed over time and then imposed on them. But I think in terms of making this relevant for us here, we have to understand the realities that, say, for example, Muslim women living as a minority of Muslims in a certain country that is not governed by Muslim law is different than women who live in countries where the laws of the state are based on Islam. And this is very important for us because sometimes we can talk about a range of issues, but the truth is, if I'm really worried about divorce rights, I kind of don't have to worry, because whatever Islam says, I live in a country that will give me certain rights that I can exercise regardless of what the religion says. If I live in a Muslim country, that's not the case. So, for example, if I have a child who's over the age of 7, a male child, for example, and this is a situation that's affecting a relative of mine, she will lose custody of that child simply because that's what the law states, that she no longer has that right, and the child goes to the custody of her husband and his parents, which then tempts her into abducting her own child so that she will not have to deal with that. I wouldn't have to be faced with that here. I would go before a judge, and what would they say? What's in the best interest of your child? So I think that we have to understand this bifurcation and the benefits we derive from living in a country that has evolved over time, that certainly women have struggled in many, many ways for years, but there are a lot of things we may take for granted that are rights that we have because we live in the United States. So, for example, maybe the primary issues we deal with as Muslims living in America have to do with things within our own community, that it doesn't really matter what Islamic jurisprudence says about it on this question, for example, of marriage over education. It's really how are we going to make changes within our own families and how people understand the importance of education and how we look at marriage. The question of leadership has come up throughout this whole day. This is very important, where it seems that people are still reluctant to give over leadership positions to Muslim women. Another issue that was one of the questions but we didn't address was marriage to non-Muslims. This is a very hot issue that nobody likes to talk about because of the issues related to where it's derived from in the text and interpretation thereof, about whether Muslim women can marry non-Muslim men, and whether they can or not, they do, right? Because here there's no consequence for that other than the social consequence. The issue of double standard, probably one of the most serious issues we face as Muslims living in America, is whether or not domestic violence is tolerated in certain communities because there's a perception that it's allowable in Islam. This is a very serious issue that many groups like the Faith Trust Institute and Peaceful Families Project are taking on and dealing with to try to mobilize more support for. On the outside, in Muslim countries, women are still being killed, sometimes in the name of Islam, to protect the honor of their family. There's a greater tolerance, perhaps, of violence against women, of withholding rights of women to education, even to food, right? Because the boy gets preference over the girl. Women lose custody of their children. They lose property. Again, personal stories of family members dealing with property rights and inheritance in the absence of a will, that immediately, as soon as they're talking about property, everybody now wants to impose Sharia, as they call it, and give the sisters less of their share of the land. Not only less, but less valuable land in the end. The issue too also of female circumcision, which some of you may or may not be familiar with, but this is really a form of genital mutilation among women in different parts of the world. And just yesterday I had a patient who came in who had her entire clitoris excised. She was Egyptian, and she's seeking asylum, and she asked me if it was haram for her to complain about this and the problems that it caused, because it happened to her by force when she was 9 years old and has caused serious issues because of the psychological trauma of that event. Where are we in terms of taking our theory of how this violates Islam and putting it into practice so that even if the laws of Egypt say this is not allowed, it's still being done, and doctors are participating in it by doing it in hospitals, for example. So there's a large gap, and the issues that are affecting our sisters outside are life-threatening. The ones that we face, again, we're protected within the context of living in the United States. And these other issues, the question that I would put into our panelists is, whether or not Islamic legal thinking argues one way or the other, what does that mean where none of it's going to be imposed on you? We don't have an Islamic legal system in our own society. This issue of the role of the minority is very important. And, for example, on the question of marriage to non-Muslims. Given that context, some of the challenges that I see that people, as we're struggling with these things, we read the Quran, we're saying this contradicts our religion. There's a frustration with the slow pace of change, with the idea that, well, if you're talking about laws and jurisprudence, how is that really going to directly impact my life today? Is that going to make things better for a small child in Somalia tomorrow? And this frustration with that. And also the lack of understanding of the process as it impacts us here. What does it mean? What is a fatwa? What relevance does that have to me? Who gets to give it? And the related question is, who is allowed to give ijtihad, and who must I listen to? Is it the sheikh at my mosque? There's a number, have you heard of it? 1-800-FATWA or something like that? I'm not kidding. People want to know answers, and this is like Asfa was saying about why the Zahiri school died out, because people today want to type in a question, is nail polish haram? They want to know the answer to that question so they can decide if they're going to put nail polish or fake nails on, and if somebody's going to tell them while they're at prayer, oh, you can't, your prayer's not good, your wudu is not valid because you have nail polish on. Now that's an issue, right? We've all heard it. It's not a serious issue, but it's still an issue, and that's sometimes people's lives that really becomes the issue that matters to them. So there's this general frustration, and there's this question of who has the authority and who must I listen to. If one person says one thing and another says another, what does that mean to me as an individual? And do I just, since I'm not governed by these laws, can I ignore everybody and do my own thing, which leads to this notion of what I would call vigilante ijtihadism. So these vigilante mujtahids, and you see them, and there's plenty of people out there who say, I'm a mujtahid. No, I'm a mujtahid. And what does ijtihad really mean? And to me it relates to this frustration that we know Islam is a religion where God communicates directly with us, yet I'm not qualified to interpret the Quran, I don't know the Arabic as well, yet I still have to live out Islam in my life. And how do I do that when there are these issues that contradict my understanding of what Islam says about human beings, human rights, and the rights of women in particular? So that's what I'd like to sort of open with, and I will introduce Dr. Maher Hattout, who has been one of the first and foremost thinkers about issues related to the rights of women in Islam for many, many years. It's only now that people are catching up to him, and so we really have him to thank for a lot of this clear thinking that has been the hallmark of our community for a long time. Dr. Hattout?